Well, good day there, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Well, as you might remember, the last video, I showed you how I make these little mini zines folded up, and there's two different kinds. There's a 6-page version and a 12-page version. Well, I've been wanting to do some paper negative photography, and I was thinking that it would be kind of cool to make a little photo book in this mini zine format. So that's what we're going to do. Stay tuned. Well, I've done this periodically, is load individual pieces of photo paper into a film camera and shoot them in the camera, and it's especially handy when you have a camera with an electronically controlled shutter, meaning the shutter is really accurate. It's not like an old mechanical shutter that you don't know the accuracy of. So I've done a lot of these over the years with my Bronica ETRS, but my Bronica, the only film back I have, it currently has a roll of film in it, and I didn't want to deal with that. So I figured I would use a 35mm camera, and I use this Minolta X700. I've been a Minolta user since the late 1970s. So the X700 was sitting around, didn't have any film in it. I thought it would be a good time to use it. X700 is an aperture priority camera, so I like to keep the camera on A, or aperture priority, and then I'll choose my aperture on the lens. For a lot of these images I was shooting at f2.8, and then the key features that makes this handy for paper negative photography is that my paper negatives, the grade 2 RC paper, I rate at an ISO of 12. So this ISO on this camera goes all the way down to 25, but it also has an exposure compensation dial. So if I dial the exposure compensation to +1.5 at ISO 25, that gets it to about ISO 12, which means I can actually shoot and meter the scene for paper negatives directly in the camera, which is really cool. Pop the camera open. Basically, I'm going to need to load between the two rails here, sitting on these machine surfaces, which is where the film rides on. That's the film plane. And there is a little recessed screw, like a pin right here. And that was a handy place to set the end of the paper into. So it basically measured 1 5/8 inches from this flange to this flange here. And I'm using about a 2-inch long piece of paper. So in the darkroom, I'll load the paper like that. This little pin becomes my reference point. It keeps the paper from slipping any further. And I usually just kind of cock it at a slight angle to keep it in there. And then the pressure plate of the camera back will keep that paper nice and firm when you close it up. So on an 8x10 sheet of photo paper, if you cut a 2-inch wide strip along the 8-inch side here, you can get 4 pieces of paper that are 1 5/8 by 2 inches, and then you can get an additional piece of paper that's 1.5 by 2 inches, and so you can get 5 paper negatives out of one of these 2-inch wide strips, which comes out to be quite economical in use. Okay, so I've cut these pieces of grade 2 photo paper out, and also my contact print paper, and I cut them ahead of time, and I put them in this little envelope, light tight, that I seal up with a clothespin, and I can keep that in the dark room, and it makes it a lot easier to quickly change out the paper negatives into my camera when I'm doing a series of images. And I'm going to contact print the paper negatives using my enlarger as a light source. I can put my different filter grades here in the filter holder, timing it with my Time-O-Light darkroom timer, and I just use a sheet of glass over here, press it down and hold it during the duration of the exposure. So I did an initial test strip on one of the first prints, and after I achieved the right exposure time, I didn't have to do any more test strips for the remainder of the images, because I just referenced the tones on the previously made prints to give me a good idea of the time for the next print. So I process the individual prints and negatives in this little setup here, these little plastic cups. I fill them up. Normally I only fill them up to the 100 milliliter line where this tape mark is, but I filled them higher so that these pieces of paper could be fully immersed. I was able to move these prints from one cup to the other just by using this little stirring wand, so I didn't have to get my fingers into it. Basically, I go developer, I'm using LPD paper developer diluted around 1:4, then a little 30-second water rinse, stop bath, another 30-second water rinse, and then fixer for 2 minutes. And then a little quick rinse in the sink, and then this is my holding bath before I dry them and put them in the drying cabinet. So this was a nice quick way to do these little tiny negatives and prints. So I ended up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 images, right? And the first, well, there was a few of them, like for instance here and here, I was not actually using the internal metering of the camera. I was using a handheld meter, but this was also taken in harsh daylight. These two next ones were done in shaded daylight, and they came out a lot better. I think I liked this one because there's a light bulb above my head, which kind of like, hey, he has an idea, a light bulb. I did end up printing that one right here. And then I took a couple pictures of my wife. Here she is wearing her flowery face mask, and here she is without the face mask. Now this was taken with a 28mm lens, and it was taken really close up. So it has that classic wide-angle lens facial distortion problem. Not a great portrait lens. But anyways, I went ahead and made a contact print of both this and of this right here. So then this tree shot in the backyard, the light was getting a little bit partially overcast, so nice soft shadows. The metering was done automatically by the camera, and a nice contact print there. So these next two shots right here were done during more of a bright daylight condition, and the meter in the camera kind of was compensating for the bright sky behind the trellis, and so you don't really see any of the foreground detail of this rusted motorcycle sprocket. This image here is a tree branch with one of these little globe lights hanging from a wire, and you barely see that, but the meter again was really compensating for the daylight behind the branches, so it was a little underexposed. So I didn't print either of these. This was a close-up of the hedge behind my house, and I really like that shot, and it printed really nice. I like just looking at the negative, you can tell there's a lot of nice midtones in there. And then this fallout shelter sign that I have attached to the door of my man cave shed, I went ahead and printed that. And finally the picture of my hat, and that came out nice also as a contact print. So the negatives were shot on Freestyle Photos Arista brand grade 2 RC paper, and the contact prints were done on Ilford Multigrade 4 warm tone RC paper, and I used a contrast filter of 2 for these prints here. Sequencing is really important in photo books, photo essays, and so I'm going to have to think about this. I think what I'm going to do is this one picture of my wife wearing the face mask will be the front cover picture, and then the last picture in the book will be her face without the face mask. So that kind of presents the possibility of a narrative. And so I'm going to have to figure out how the inner pieces of the book can be made into a story from the remaining 5 photos. But in the meantime, I do have some things to do. I need to make the book basically out of black paper, but I'm not going to glue it together. As you might remember from the previous video, these 12-page books, I glue the front and back covers together with 2 layers of paper to make a stiffer book. I'm not going to do that right away because I need to, after folding the book up, I'm going to need to cut little windows out precisely for each image, and then we'll have to stick the images in the prints into the gap between the pages into their little window, and then I'm going to secure the prints together with some artist tape. It's an acid-free archival tape, pH neutral, so that presents a possibility eventually I could take those pictures out of the book if I needed to. They won't be permanently in there, but so then I'll have to figure out how I'm going to finally glue up the outer cover to make it more secure once the pictures are there. I don't really want a plaster glue stick over the edge of the print on the front cover, for instance, so I'm going to have to figure out how I'm going to do that. Well, I'm going to be using this, I told you, Art Portfolio black refill paper. It comes in letter size. All right. So this right here is going to be the actual front cover of the book, and this leaf here will eventually gets folded around and glued on the back side. Okay, so it's important that we figure out the sequencing of the story before we start cutting the windows in our template because some of the pictures are portrait oriented and some are landscape oriented, and so you have to know there. So I think I'm going to start and end the sequence with the pictures of my wife. First of all, on the front cover with her wearing her mask, and at the end of it without the mask. I think the picture right in the middle, there are 7 images, so there's a center image, right? The 4th image is the fallout shelter sign, which is kind of cool because it kind of, I don't know, maybe it implies something with our current virus situation, fallout shelter. And then there's 2 other images that are sort of more related to me, obviously my portrait and then my hat. And I think that might go on either side of that. And then there are these 2 kind of what you might call nature scenes. My wife likes to garden and whatnot, so this is a picture of one of the hedges, the close-up, and this is our tree that we grew from a seedling in our yard. And so that's kind of a whole little narrative story that we might do there. So I think that's the sequence. So that's going to dictate the orientation of the cutouts in our paper. I want to start marking the lines for the cuts for the windows, and I'm going to use a mechanical pencil to mark those lines, but I want to do it on the reverse side because I don't want those pencil marks showing up. So I'll start with the reverse side of the front cover, and I'm going to in fact label this front in pencil on the back side of this so I know what it is. So my 35mm images, my contact prints are 24 by 36 millimeters each. So I'm going to have to lay out little rectangles and have to decide if I want them centered on the page or slightly raised, which I think it looks nicer. The way you would mat and frame a print is usually you have it raised up slightly above the center. Okay, so for laying out the portrait and landscape oriented window cuts, let's talk about the portrait oriented one first. So I've found the vertical center line of the panel, and this cutout needs to be 24 millimeters wide, so I measure 12 millimeters over from the center line, and then I mark those, I draw these vertical lines, and then I find the vertical center of the panel and I move up 5 millimeters and then move up half of the 36, which is 18, mark it, and then mark down 36 for this. So this makes a 24 by 36 panel that is off-centered vertically by 5 millimeters. And then for the landscape oriented panel, it's a similar process. I first measure my 36 by finding the vertical center line, measuring 18 over, making 2 lines that are 36 millimeters across. And then I find the vertical center of the panel. I move up 5 millimeters and then move up half of 24, which is 12. That defines this line. 24 millimeters down defines that line. So again, this makes a 36 by 24 horizontally or landscape oriented window that's centered 5 millimeters above the center of the page. So you can see now that these 2 marks are even with each other, they're centered with each other, but they're vertically displaced a little bit 5 millimeters above. Okay, so now before I actually put the razor knife to the paper, this is a really good opportunity to double check my layout and make sure everything is oriented properly. Now I can start cutting out these holes. Well, so we're ready to start taping our pictures in. So here's the front cover shot right here. And it's going to go like this. I'll have to center it up on the front window, but you might notice that there's a good allowance for taping along these 3 edges, especially the bottom and the 2 sides, maybe not so much the top, but I'm going to basically overlap the tape. This tape is 3/4 inches wide, so I'll have about roughly 3/8 of an inch. I don't want to overlap the tape to the folds. Okay, here are the 7 pictures taped down. I've made sure they're nice and secure, so hey, let's just fold it up. I don't, of course, have any of the copy, the words written yet, but let's fold it and see what it looks like, at least this way. Let's see. Oh, yes. Ah, that looks really nice. I've got to come up with a sequence of copy or text. Okay, so what am I going to do for the fallout shelter sign? Okay, that might do. So about 1.5 inches by maybe 2 inches looks like a good size for the text. This is my first verse, and I'm going to use this double-sided tape. So the way I'm going to do this is kind of tricky. I'm going to try to put it right on the top, and if there's any residual, which there usually is, I will trim it now off the edge. And now I have these 2 faint pencil marks that I have to line up the top 2 corners. Try to get it parallel to the sides of the book. Like that. And the bottom of it is loose, so it kind of floats a little bit like that. Okay, so before I glue the cover, or actually tape it, I think I'm going to put some double-sided tape on these parts right here. Okay, that should stay together pretty well. So now the next part is the back cover is going to get tucked behind the front cover like that. Now let's see if we can fold the front cover, keep it even. The last part is where the front cover wraps around the back, the front flyleaf or whatever. This gives it a spine of a certain thickness. See if I can get this to be even. Okay. Well, I really enjoyed this project. It involved numerous types of crafts that I enjoy, like, of course, photography, but especially making these tiny little paper negatives and contact prints. It's really, there's something satisfying about those, that little hand-size image. And then, of course, the whole craft of making these little zines and carefully cutting them out and trying to be as precise as you can with your measurements and your cuts and everything. And the whole thing is just really satisfying. And of course, the finished result is just a beautiful little gem of a book. The verse in the book is not particularly great, but it's just a little story that it tells, and that's what I think all zines should do. They should be telling a little story. That's what I love about zines. They're just compact enough to be able to represent a compact little narrative, a story, without being too big or too convoluted or too complex. So again, there's a lot of zine makers out there over the last half century or more that zines have been around, and it's really inspiring to go looking online for zine makers. The inspiration for these particular zines, of course, came from Austin Kleon, the writer and artist, but I really like this whole concept of these little mini-sized prints in a mini-sized zine. Well, if you guys have any spare time on your hands, I don't know why you would, but if you happen to have any spare time on your hands, hey, give this a shot. This is really fun to do, and it's really satisfying. Well, drop a note down below if you have any further questions or comments, and until next time, stay safe, stay creative, and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.